Welcome to the HR Chat Show, one of the world's most downloaded and shared podcasts designed for HR pros, talent execs, tech enthusiasts, and business leaders. For hundreds more episodes and what's new in the world of work, subscribe to the show, follow us on social media, and visit hrgazette.com.
Welcome to another episode of the HR Chat Show. I'm your host today, Bill Banham, and joining me on this episode is Adam Weber, host of the popular HR Superstars podcast and SVP of Community over at 15Five, where he supports and leads thousands of HR professionals through the HR Superstars community, elevating them to become more strategic listeners. Regular listeners of my show will know that I always get a bit nervous when I'm interviewing another podcast host, because they can see straight through all my techniques and my interviewing style, but we'll give it a go nonetheless. Adam's a lovely bloke. We've had a chance to have a couple of conversations now. Adam, welcome to the show today.
Thanks, Bill. It's so good to be here. And this is a judgment-free zone here. I also feel the same way. And I think you're going to come on my podcast too. So I'll be, you'll have a chance to turn the tables here soon.
Absolutely. So listeners, Adam has been gracious enough to offer me and People and Performance podcast co-host Christopher Bjorling an opportunity to jump on his pod too. So watch this space. Why don't we start by getting to know a bit more about yourself? Why don't you take a minute or two and introduce yourself to our audience?
Sure. A little bit about myself. I was a two-time tech founder. So I started a mobile app development company about 15 years ago. And then really that's where I first kind of got a passion for leadership and culture. And then through that process, actually co-founded a company called Emplify, which is engagement measurement, where we would measure cultures and then coach executives on how to build high-performance teams. And we really got at like the heart of what motivates an employee. And then through that work, that's when I transitioned my own career kind of coincidentally with that into the chief people officer role. So I was both a practitioner, but also running a company that was all about building these high-performance teams. And so now, and then my company got acquired 2.5 years ago by 15Five, which is an amazing full suite performance management software company. And they already had a chief people officer. And so they were like, well, what do you want to do? And I was like, well, what I love is talking about people and culture. And so, and there's a huge need, right? There are more pressures today on HR leaders than there's ever been. And there's not enough resources to help them on the new side, that strategic side of HR. And so for the last 2.5 years, that's what I've been doing. I lead this HR Superstars community, which is a private social network for HR leaders to learn and grow and ask questions. And we create one signature resource a month. And I host this podcast as well called the HR Superstars Podcast, where we talk about kind of the best of the best in the HR industry. And all of it is really about making the strategic side of HR feel manageable, feel accessible, and help elevate HR leaders' careers to where they have earned that strategic seat at the table. So that's me now.
Okay, beautiful. Thank you very much. Let's talk a bit more about the formats of your podcast then. So it's an interview format. It's about 20, 30 minutes on average. Tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, the HR Superstars podcast is it's about a 30-minute episodes where we just get to know people's stories, top HR leaders, the people that have really elevated to become strategic, who've earned a voice, a seat at the table. And we hear what are they working on now? What are they passionate about? We try to get specific too. I really want to understand ways that people are practically bringing some of their initiatives to life as well. And by the way, we've been really fortunate to have some amazing guests. We've had Katie Burke from HubSpot, the chief people officer there. We've had Holly May, the chief people officer at Walgreens. Daniel Coyle, who wrote the book, The Culture Code, which is a great book and a really fun episode as well.
Thanks for tuning in to the HR Chat Podcast. If you're enjoying this episode, we'd really appreciate it if you could subscribe and leave a 5-star review on your podcast platform of choice. And now, back to the conversation.
And from one podcaster to another, Adam, why do you enjoy this? What are you getting out of it? What are you learning from this experience as a host?
I heard someone once talk about privilege as when you recognize that you have privilege, rather than feeling guilty about it, what you should do instead is unlock that privilege for as many people as you can. And that's what the podcast is all about for me. When being like a co-founder of an HR software company, I've had access to thousands of the best leaders in HR. But they were always conversations that were one-on-one. And the podcast, what I love about it is that those conversations are now out in the open where everyone has access to the information, where everyone kind of can take the first step in becoming more strategic. And so that's probably what I'm the most passionate about for doing the podcast. And the second is like it is a great way for me to learn. I get to talk to such brilliant people and just hear what they're working on, and I gain a lot of knowledge out of that too.
I also find it's great for networking. You know, if you're working remotely a lot, be like, hey, let's book half an hour and use that time to have a conversation. We'll record it at the same time and get you out there to the audience. It's a great way to get to know someone in a very short space of time, to understand a bit more about what they do, how they help the world of work, and of course, expand your network with lots of awesome, clever people. But this is not an interview with me. That's coming as part 2 on your show. So let's continue through. You mention often, Adam, that HR leaders are under immense pressure. What do you think is the main cause of that? You mentioned earlier on there are lots of additional pressures on HR folks, more perhaps than previously. And I'm going to guess one of those pressures is dealing with the rise of AI and how that's augmenting and replacing functions and all the rest of it. And there's a whole bunch of other contextual pressures going on in the world right now. Give us your take.
Yeah, I definitely think AI is a big part of it. I think at the fundamental level, it's that the HR industry as a whole and what HR actually is fundamentally shifting, right? So when HR kind of originated, it was aligned to a culture where people worked for 30, 40 years. And so it was focused around things like payroll and benefits and stability and legal protection, or CYA HR. But then, you have all of these new expectations and pressures on HR. COVID hits, hybrid, remote, AI, the activation of managers. There's all of these kind of competing pressures and expectations where other departments don't know where else to look. And so they're starting to look for HR leaders to kind of step up for the business. Now, the hard part is most of the other part of their job, their previous job, hasn't gone away. So they just have additional responsibilities. And yet for many of them, there aren't resources, education, other role models to look at. And so you end up in this scenario where there is pressure to grow at a timeline that doesn't kind of match the resources and guidance available that's out there.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the HR Chat Show. IEA Training provides professional development to a changing workforce with changing needs, and we're proud to support this episode of the HR Chat podcast. IEA offers lots of courses, webinars, and on-demand training to meet our students where they are and help them reach their goals. We're proud of our contribution to better risk analysis and high operating standards in the industry. Learn more at ieatraining.org. And now, back to the conversation.
What are some of the expectations of someone initially getting into HR versus what the reality is when they are in HR? What are you hearing? I mean, I know that you speak with a lot of leaders, but your team works closely with more junior HR folks, and it is a very different landscape to what it was a few years ago. So maybe reconcile some of those expectations versus the reality for us.
I think one thing and one of the reasons I love working in HR is that the average person, and I'm sure you've experienced this too, the average person that's in HR is just like a genuinely good person. They have a spirit about them that wants to make the world a better place. They genuinely care about employees. And so many of them get into HR because they go, well, this is where I could actually do work that's meaningful, and it could make the world a little bit better, and I can kind of do my part. And that's kind of where they start. And then I will say so many of them, though, immediately are faced with fire after fire after fire, or an overwhelming amount of competing priorities. And they feel this pressure and stress, and they get into employee cases, and they just sort of feel almost like they're in a deep end, trying just barely to tread water and feeling like they can't really get ahead. And so oftentimes, while they had this one kind of aspiration of what they hoped for in their career, they end up doing very different work than they expected. And I think on top of that, the challenge is that then when they try to take that first step, when they try to move into that more strategic posture, being proactive versus reactive, doing an initiative that would help build like a world-class culture, they find themselves getting rejected or blocked by the executive team. And so, yeah, I think that is a bit of the landscape that a lot of people in HR are under right now.
Fidello Inc. is a consulting firm specializing in improving human performance, and we're proud to support the HR Chat podcast. We help identify strategic competencies and behaviors that drive results. Our team offers an HR web software to manage systems, reports, and data for HR people that need the best insights to make the right decisions and achieve better results. Learn more at fidello.com.
So 15.5 works in the performance space. How have attitudes within the HR department changed over the last 10 years towards, say, the traditional performance review versus constant feedback? And by the way, this is coming from a guy who used to work for a performance management software many years ago. I know what a hard pitch that was to HR teams at the time, and how things were very much changing at the time towards that constant feedback piece. What are you guys seeing?
Yeah, I think, obviously the way that performance management was done for decades is just fundamentally broken. People would show up to these annual reviews and get feedback that was wholly surprising to them, right? And I think healthy, robust cultures, regardless of software, use performance management more as a philosophy, we call it continuous performance management, where you're giving constant feedback through leveraging your managers to give effective one-on-ones and give consistent feedback and set goals and create role clarity. And I think that's one component of it. And that is one aspect of kind of what great looks like in HR. It's, are we elevating the performance of our employees? There's another component, which is, are we reducing regrettable turnover? Like, do we have a good plan in place to make sure that our very best people feel activated and we're retaining them and we're getting the best work? And then kind of that best work component would be engagement. Like, as an HR department, do we use this? Do we have tools in place that allow us to create an environment where people are motivated to bring their best self to work every day? Do we have scientific clarity, regardless of our size of organization, on what those blockers are that are preventing people from bringing their best self to work? And you know what 15.5 really does? It takes those kind of critical components of HR, driving increasing employee performance, reducing regrettable turnover, and driving employee engagement. And it leverages software to create efficiencies, right? So that you can actually do this work as an HR person with confidence, and you can report back on it too. You can prove that the initiatives that you're putting in place are moving one of these three critical levers inside of your business.
Now then, one thing that you were keen to chat with me today about was the traits that separate the top 10% from everyone else. You've talked to thousands of HR leaders, and you've said you've noticed a few traits that do separate those top folks in that top 5 or 10% from the others. Can you explain what some of those traits are?
Yeah, absolutely. And the reason I'm so passionate about this is back to what I shared earlier, is that there are all of these people who got into HR who had these noble aspirations to build a more human-centered workforce, and they just keep getting blocked. And they're frustrated and they feel like they're just kind of running into this wall. And yet through these, I've spent the last decade having these conversations, and there are a few trends I've noticed from these leaders who are not getting blocked, who have gotten to that executive seat at the table, but not just they're using it well. They're building kind of that world-class culture. And so here are the 5. The first is that they speak the language of the business. So as an HR leader, do I understand what the top goals are of the business? And then do I then translate my HR strategy and connect it to the business objectives? So for example, if there is a churn issue or a retention issue at the company level that's a top company priority, am I doing the work then to think, well, how could we leverage the HR department to help solve that? could we, focus on the customer success team and drive engagement there, or, whatever it may be. It's that we understand what is going on inside of the business, the language that the executives at the company use, and we then use that language when we build our HR strategy. So that's the first one. The second is that they use metrics and data to back up their bold initiatives and ideas. So no more squishy talk, no more just because it's right. Look, there's some noble and good and kind of no duh moments that happen in HR, but to be a legitimate business partner, it is critical that, and this is what the best leaders do, is that they use data and metrics, and back to kind of what I was sharing with like a tool like 15Five, right? You should be able to have a score that tells you how effective your managers are, or how engaged your employees are, or how big of an issue regrettable turnover is. And then you make informed decisions on what to prioritize based on what you're seeing in the data. And so no more fire to fire to fire to fire. We strategically rank and focus on what we work on proactively based on what we see in the data. And then the third is when you kind of see in the data there's an issue and you have confidence on what action to take to solve that issue, when you go to the executive team, you show courage when pitching your idea. And this, by the way, I think is actually the most important. This is something I have seen in those thousands of conversations. How often an HR leader will feel so much conviction and then go and present apathetically, get rejected, and not try to push through. And so build your business case, put some metrics behind it, put some provable outcomes behind it, and then fight for a yes. And if you don't get a yes, keep fighting until you at least have business context to understand the no. And the fourth would be report back on the ROI. So when you get approval, you hold yourself accountable to what you committed to, right? And you may hit your goals, you may not, but you will foster and build goodwill when you report back on the progress of these bold initiatives with your executive team. Hey, we said we'd reduce regrettable turnover by 10%. Here's where we are in the process. We're actually currently at this rate. Maybe you're exceeding, maybe you're behind, but you're kind of continuing that loop. It's not just like we got approval and then we disappear. We got approval and we hold ourselves accountable for the things we commit to. And then the fifth one is that the best HR leaders are also incredible at communication. They're internal communication wizards. And what they do is they foster this kind of general sense at the company that this is an amazing place to work. And that works like with all the different stakeholders in HR. So for example, if you think about managers, a great HR leader is so good at internal communication that managers want to participate in their initiatives because they communicate how it makes their world better, more efficient, more effective. It creates clearer conversations, whatever it may be. Or to the employee, they build alignment to the core values or to the vision of the company or alignment to the strategy. They go, this is a super cool place to work. Like I actually know what the goals are. I know what my work is. And a lot of that comes from an HR leader's ability to build a strategy where the employee goes, hey, we're building something special here. So those are the five. I think those are the things that I have seen that, these folks that come on the podcast, this is kind of a consistent thread that kind of jumps out of the people who are doing well right now.
I would fully support that in terms of what I'm hearing on the HR Chat pod and the People and Performance pod and the HR in Review pod as well, actually. Different audiences, different geographies are all saying similar things to what you just mentioned there. Adam, before we wrap up for today, sir, how can we connect with you? Is that LinkedIn? Do you want to share your email address? I bet you're super cool and you're all over X and Instagram and TikTok and places, right?
I'm still not on TikTok. I'm dabbling. We'll see if I join the HR TikTok movement. But right now, the best place, and I share kind of fresh ideas every single week on LinkedIn. So if you just go to linkedin.com/meet Adam, you can find me on LinkedIn, and I'd love to connect with you there.
Rock and roll. Well, Chris Bearding and I are very much looking forward to being on the other side of the virtual table and answering the hard-hitting questions that you're going to ask of us on your pod. But for today, it just leaves me to say, Adam, thank you very much for being my guest.
Bill, it was a privilege. Thanks so much for having me. Enjoyed it.
And listeners, as always, until next time, happy working.
Thanks for listening to the HR Chat Show. If you enjoyed this episode, why not subscribe and listen to some of the hundreds of episodes published by HR Gazette? And remember, for what's new in the world of work, subscribe to the show, follow us on social media, and visit hrgazette.com.